I'm Rosemary, and this is a special Whisky Wednesday for you. I want to talk to you today about a Canadian whisky, a Canadian single malt whisky, which comes from the Still Waters distillery in Ontario. It's called Stalk and Barrel, and it's really interesting. So I've got a dram already poured in my glass, and it's very fruity on the nose, but perhaps not in a way. I'm not sure
I understand.
Be quiet, Apple Watch. Shh. Honestly, things are always chipping in these days. It is fruity, but it's not sort of appley, which is really rather surprising. It's also not berry fruits. It's just quite lively on the nose. It's very young. This is bottled at 3 years old. So obviously it's not going to have the same gravitas from the wood as a 12, a 15 and 18-year-old. But it is suggestive of something great to come in future years. So, that's very interesting. When I first tasted this whisky, because obviously I've tasted it before, I was very struck in the first instance by the mouthfeel, because I think a lot of whiskies that aren't either Scottish or Irish tend to be more viscous, and that can be a little bit off-putting, rather more oily in feel in the mouth. But I'm not getting that today, which is interesting. We've only recently had lunch, so whether that is to do with my palate, but as you know, if you are a real whisky fan, you know, you can have 2 drams on different days from the same bottle, and how you are feeling and how the weather is, etc., will make your enjoyment of that dram a very different experience. So this feels different from what I was expecting on the mouth, in the mouth rather. Lots of pepper, lots and lots of pepper. It doesn't linger, but why would it? It's only 3 years old. It's rushing on to do the next thing. And because of that, there isn't any huge depth of flavour. But having said that, it lingers brilliantly, and it's a very pleasant taste and flavour in the mouth. So it's a very interesting whisky. Now, Still Waters Distillery really led the way in micro distilleries in Canada. And I did read somewhere that this is the first single malt to be distilled in the state of Ontario for a decade. Not a decade, that's goodness, I've been alive for lots of those. In a century. I haven't been alive for any of those yet, before you ask. So it's a bit of a breakthrough, and it's 2 whisky guys who loved their whisky, were businessmen, decided to put their passion into reality and set up this distillery in 1991. I mean 2009, forget 1991. I don't know, well, whisky in the middle of the day, I suppose. So these 2 guys have set up this distillery, and they started off making vodka, which is of great interest to me because there are some cracking vodkas being made now in Scotland, and I am going to tell you about 2 of those in particular over the next few weeks. Second sip of this whisky. It's sort of sunk in my mouth below my bottom row of teeth, and it's all fruit and pepper round here. It's a most strange but delicious sensation. And yeah, as I say, for 3 years old, you certainly can't say it's short on flavour. So having honed their skills on making a craft vodka, these guys then cracked into the whiskey and started with their single malt with all Canadian barley, and they then went into rye and other grains. The Americans and Canadians are really keen on making whiskey from other grains. I've even tasted one made from millet. Oh, it's a pretty girl, right? It just makes for very interesting drinking, whether you would clear out your whiskey barrel and fill it with other grain whiskies from around the world. I don't know. I certainly wouldn't do that. But anyway, these guys eventually made a rye whiskey because, of course, American and Canadian whiskies are often rye whiskies, and that still accounts for over 50% of their production. But as they're getting older, remember they founded in 2009, they are getting some older whiskies now in the store. So at some stage, they'll be releasing things, I think, with real gravitas. So very surprisingly fruity, aged in ex-bourbon barrels, quite different from the Glasgow 1770 range. Do you remember at Christmas I told you about one of the first releases from the Glasgow distillery, again releasing very young whiskey, but that had a very different flavour to it from this whiskey. I could leap up in an elegant way and get that out of the cupboard and just compare it, but I'm not going to. That might happen another day. I've added a little drop of water. I don't like that at all with the water, because it's almost as though it's so young and it's so fresh and it's so just starting to give, that by adding water it's almost a slap back and said, no, don't do that, instead of letting it develop and be its own person. So I bought this because my husband and I have been having virtual holidays, virtual weekends away since the autumn. I'm making this video in March 2021 when a lot of the world is still under lockdown. And we live in Orkney, an island group off the north of Scotland, and we absolutely love it here, but in the long dark days we did decide to spice up our lives by having some virtual travel. And so in January this year we had a lovely visit to eastern Canada and up the Maritime coast to Newfoundland, virtually from the comfort of our sofa. Very low carbon travel. But what we do is we plan our recipes, our menus for the weekend according to the foods of the area, and try when possible to get some of their drink as well. So I had a look to see what was available in terms of Canadian whiskey other than the good old Canadian Club. Saw this as a single malt and decided to buy it. No, definitely not. No, much better as a straight whiskey without the water. So I bought this, I bought it online, and it cost me getting on for £50. So obviously on top of all the taxes and things, there's import taxes. So if you ask me, would I buy it again? At that cost, probably not. But should I find myself again actually in Canada, I would certainly seek it out to drink over there. But on these virtual travel weekends, we get around by watching YouTube videos. And while we were in Canada, we discovered some new travel vloggers who we were very taken with. A couple of brothers called the Varga brothers. And what endears them to me is that they are into their food. And so in terms of virtual eating, we've done an awful lot better since we've been hooked up with them than we were doing before. But in one boozy night, I can't remember whether they were in Ontario or Montreal, they finished off their evening with whiskey. Yes, I am doing this, with maple syrup in it. And I was so utterly horrified that I just had to try it. And how much you add is obviously just up to you. And you know what? It actually, well, of course, it changes the drink completely. But if you think of the liqueurs that you might have at the end of an evening, you know, drambuie, things of that nature, the sweetness adds to this very young whiskey. I might as well put that in there as well, mightn't I? To this very young whiskey, that sweet maple syrup flavour, which, let's face it, isn't overpoweringly sweet, it's naturally sweet, actually adds some age to it. And yeah, okay, you've turned off and I'm now just speaking to my iPhone and I'm just a sad old woman sitting in the corner of her kitchen chatting as though you're still there, but in fact you've gone in horror. If by any chance you are still there, dear viewer, if you buy a whiskey that doesn't actually rock your socks or, you know, rock your boat, and you do have maple syrup in the house for your porridge, it's actually not bad. I was chatting to a foodie friend about it, and we were saying, she was saying that she could imagine me making an ice cream with some whiskey in it, and maybe maple syrup as well, and maybe some caramelized pecan nuts. And I may just have to do that. But as a Whiskey Wednesday novelty, I would actually recommend Stork and Barrel single malt whiskey to you from Canada. It is handmade. They say it's handmade from grain to glass. On the front, it tells you where the cask was in the store, and it's actually, I should have told you this before, I suppose, 46% ABV. It's different. It is a step up, a huge mountainous step up from Canadian Club. I like it, but I wouldn't be getting on for £50 again for it. But as part of our virtual weekend away in Eastern Canada, it was fantastic. So my young friend Chris next door is a whiskey fan, and he's always very interested in what I'm telling you. And he has a really good palate. But of course, a young guy in his 20s, his palate and what he likes is very different from mine. I gave him some of this, and he said he thought it was one of the nicest whiskies he'd ever tasted. So you pays your money and you takes your choice. And I'm not saying Chris is wrong, because I respect his palate. So there we go. Stork and Barrel, single malt from Ontario in Canada. Who'd have thought it, hey? Who'd have thought it? And with maple syrup. I don't know. You just can't get the whiskey vloggers. You just can't get the whiskey vloggers these days. I think it's time to go. Bye. See you next time. Oh, by the way, if you want to read more about our travels, especially to Eastern Canada, check it out on rosemarymoon.com. And why not subscribe to these videos on YouTube if you've enjoyed them, even if they shake your perception of a whiskey vlogger. Do click the subscribe button, and then I'll see you next time. Cheers for now.